The lectionary served up a fun one today, huh? As we're in this back to school season series, I invite you to ponder some things you might have learned when you were younger that you have since discovered were not helpful, or maybe even wrong or harmful. Things you learned when you were younger, whether it's information, practices, habits, patterns that you have now since discovered don't serve you well, or now you say that was wrong, or maybe it's harmful. I am remembering that I'm sure someone taught me the proper way initially, but as a young child in school, I started to hold my pencil in a way that was comfortable for me, but didn't match the proper way to hold such a thing. And I can't quite remember how I did it. But it was maybe, you're supposed to do this, and it was something like this. And it was fine during pencil years. We didn't write that much. There was coloring and other things that were done. But then we graduated to ink pens. And the way I was holding my pen dragged my pinky and part of my hand through the still wet ink. That wasn't working so well. So then I also was trying to keep my hand from dragging in the ink so I wouldn't mess it up and get my hand coated with ink. But then also when you graduate to pens in school, do they still use pens in school? I don't know. But so back in the old days, so you start writing a whole lot more. And so the effort to keep my hand out of the ink and doing all this writing, my hand would start to cramp. So there's ink on my hand, smears on my paper, my hand is cramping. This is not working out. So I'm looking around at my fellow students, and they all hold it the same way, and it's different than I'm holding it. And they don't have smeary papers. And so I decide that what I've been doing wasn't helpful, and I was willing to learn this other way. And so I'm watching, I have models of how to do it, and so I'm working to hold my pen correctly in a helpful way. But it was so hard because I kept reverting. I had this muscle memory. There's these neural pathways of how little Michael Bush holds a writing implement, and I kept reverting. And so it took a lot of effort to unlearn the old way of holding it and to learn this, for me, new way, which though was better. And if I had not been committed to this better way and had not seen the failure of my old way, there's no way I would have gone through the trouble. I remember having a conversation with a woman who was on the music staff of a church I served, and she also taught in schools and gave private lessons. And she said, as a teacher, one of the hardest things for her is when she encounters a student who has practiced the piece incorrectly. Because not only do you still have to teach them how to play the piece properly, but there's the unlearning of what's already been practiced, and that's just harder. Well, I'm bringing all this up because when we're talking about Rabbi Jesus, the teachings of Jesus, the way of Jesus, he doesn't offer the reign of God as this kind of like nice little add-on to the ways we've all already decided to live our lives, for the ways we live individually or as a society. He's talking about ways that call us to recognize there's things we do, behaviors, actions, attitudes, structures that don't serve us well. As a matter of fact, do harm to us, do harm to others. So we have to unlearn old ways and also learn new ways, and it's incredibly difficult. I think about that song I learned as a kid. It was a vacation Bible school. I don't think we had it in the Pilgrim hymnal of the Congregational Church, but it was, I have decided to follow Jesus. That's sort of a little sing, as if like that's an easy thing to do. Not really. Worth it, but it's hard. And Jesus is acknowledging the difficulty. And that is a big theme in this challenging gospel reading that we have before us today. And in order to kind of get into the understanding of where Jesus is coming from, some of us might have to do a little unlearning right now around one of the words that was in there. I mean, you probably, maybe, I don't know, I've only known John for a couple years, but he doesn't go around saying hell, hell, hell a lot. So this might be the most you've ever heard John talk about hell. And for some of you, you might be like, yeah, I've been waiting for some hell. And others, though, might be feeling triggered and anxious, like, what's this hell stuff? What are we going to do with that? So the word that's in the oldest manuscripts we have of the New Testament, which are written in Greek, the word that's there that traditionally gets translated into English, including the New Revised Standard Version, as hell, is a word that is Gehenna. Gehenna. I'm going to do a little, even though I was kind of playfully saying Jesus is not Mr. Rogers with a beard, I'm going to do a little Mr. Rogers thing with you. Say that with me, would you? Gehenna. Gehenna. Gehenna, when the people that Jesus is addressing and who first told these stories and even wrote them down, when they hear Gehenna, they do not think red guy with horns and a pitchfork in an underworld tormenting souls eternally. They've never heard of that. That's not even part of any worldview or story that's their story. That will come much, much later. When they hear Gehenna, there's likely a couple things that come to mind, and one is the physical place that is called Gehenna. That's a real geographic spot. It's just outside of Jerusalem. It's this little valley. And we don't know exactly the whole time frame it was used this way, but there's evidence, archaeological evidence, that Gehenna was the garbage dump for the city of Jerusalem. And a reason, the thought might be why, I mean, it's a convenient location, but also there's a story in the Hebrew Scriptures about something that happened in Gehenna. Humans sacrificed to a god called Moloch. That is horrific. And so what's that property good for? Right? That's the story connected with that place. And so it's a garbage dump place. And there would be fires in it, and stinking and rotting and decomposing. It's awful. I mean, most of us don't just like hang out in garbage dumps where things are decomposing, etc. I mean, I don't even like, if something died in a wash, I can't walk down that path anymore because it takes a while. So, and there's this thing, right, we're repulsed by that. So it also, though, becomes a symbol. When you hear certain geographic name places, you have ideas that come to mind. The Big Apple, Sarita, right? I bet some certain things pop into your head. Reputations, ideas, what kind of place is this? So they'd hear Gehenna, but there's some symbolism of Gehenna by the time we get to Jesus, and that is an idea that represents life lived apart from God, garbage dump life. Not where you're going to go when you die someday. That wasn't their concern. That's not how they'd hear it. They hear it as, when you hear Gehenna, it's hell, but it's hell on earth hell. It's you're living in hell, you're giving hell to others, it's no way to be. So it's the awful example. Gehenna is not where you want to live, and it's not what you want to give. So hold that in your minds as we move into the story. So one continuity with last week's story and image that Jesus picks up today. Last week we were talking some about life that is soulful versus selfish, or are we living as children of God or spoiled children? And a way to measure that or to pay attention that Jesus offered his disciples is he put a young child in their midst. And he challenges them to consider, how are you welcoming the young child, but also that represents the most vulnerable? How do you welcome, engage? Are you in relationship with the people who can't pay you back? How you treat them is a good way to measure if you're living soulful or selfish. And so he's continuing that thread today when he says, if you cause one of these little ones to stumble, the vulnerable, not just children, the vulnerable, if you're doing something that puts stumbling blocks in front of the vulnerable, now here's where, remember when I said Jesus, not Mr. Rogers with a beard? He says, it'd be better millstone around your neck, plunged into the sea. Jesus said that. Whoa, Jesus, come on, that's not nice. But Jesus is wanting his disciples to get it. Take this seriously. How you treat people matters. It's not a philosophical idea. Jesus is saying, if you're engaging in ways that are causing stumbling, taking life away from others, you are wasting space. You are wasting breath. You've been given the gift of life, and if you use it to harm and abuse other people, why are you here? That's where he's going with that imagery. Because it's harder to ignore when he says something like that, right? Okay. So I imagine the disciples at this point saying, all right, we don't want to do that. Right? We do not want to be those people. And that's where he goes then with the next piece. He said, okay, so if your hand causes you to sin, cut it off, and it's better to have one hand than to be in Gehenna. So we'll unpack that a little bit. Remember, sin we talked about last week isn't that you're evil or a bad person or just bad action. Sin is separation from God, separation from who you are as God's beloved child, and then that gets lived out in separation from other people. So Jesus says, if there's something that you're doing or living or thinking that causes separation for you and for others, be committed to get rid of it. Be committed to be free of it. Now, I've had this argument, you might too. Well, did you have to go to amputation imagery, Jesus? That's pretty harsh. Remember, he's on a little bit of a harsh streak here. So why would he use something like that? And by the way, a little aside, this is evidence that even people who are literalists when it comes to the Bible aren't really. Because there is no mega church with people walking around with one hand. So almost every Christian understands that there's symbolism in what Jesus says. We just sometimes get choosy about which things we want to be symbols and which things we take literally. So, all right, why though use such imagery? This, I believe, is where Jesus is really letting us know this is not trite. It's not a throwaway image or idea. He's using this intentionally because it is so hard to unlearn what we've already learned. Even if it keeps us separate, even if it's harmful, it's already in us. It feels like it's part of us. I think of this cliche we have where we say, I know it like the back of my hand. Then Jesus says, well, then get rid of that hand. If it's keeping you separate from God, from others, from who you are, because that's hell. Not just one day, it's Gehenna now. It's garbage dump life. And so you're familiar with it, these patterns, the ways you think or understand or feel or act. It feels like it's part of you, but he's saying it's not really what you need. So it feels sacrificial, it's hard, but be committed to be free of that, to get rid of that, so that you can, instead of give hell and live hell, how about you give heaven and live heaven here and now? And so he's acknowledging, but we've all learned ways, it's embedded in us, ways of separation, ways of alienation, ways that don't serve us well, ways that even hurt us and hurt others. So Jesus is wanting us to take it seriously. So be absolutely committed to be free of those ways. And that's, I think, why he uses such hard imagery. He's acknowledging, he says, I feel you. It is not easy. It is incredibly hard to unlearn in order to learn even a better way. He doesn't, though, just give us the picture that's hard. He also, Jesus teaches a life and practice that really is living into that way. And our psalmist this morning, Jesus doesn't make it all up. He's drawing on his faith tradition. Our psalmist is talking about the same ideas. The psalmist is talking about that he wants to live at one with God. He doesn't want to live in, he uses language, sin and separation, miss the mark, miss the aim. And so he talks about the tools and resources that he puts himself in front of in order to live into God's reign, God's love, God's justice, God's mercy. So he names, this translation said law. The Hebrew word is Torah. He needs the Torah, which means literally teaching. It comes to represent the first 5 books of the scriptures. But he's talking about, I need ideas, I need images, I need something just beyond myself. And so he keeps putting himself in front of those stories and ideas that stretch and challenge. I'm someone, and those of you who are on social media, you know I love being outside in the beauty of nature. The sunrises, the sunsets. There was a rainbow at sunrise yesterday. I got a picture of it. I was so excited. And that is, by the way, for me, spiritual practice, to see all of that beauty. It reminds me of something greater and bigger. But for me, it's also not enough, because a sunrise has never challenged my selfishness. And a sunset has never called me to act for justice. And so that's part of it, those kind of images and ideas, but we need a better story. In order to let go of the old stories that might do harm or the old ways of understanding or living, we need inspiration, we need vision. Jesus keeps going on about the reign of God because he's telling a better story of a just world for all, of healing and compassion and wholeness, because we need a better story in order to be willing to let go of the old, because we know it like the back of our hand. But it's also not just the scriptures or the teachers or mentors or spiritual directors. It's also his language of prayer. He says, and help me, reveal to me the things I don't see. And I think God loves that prayer because, of course, it's hard for us to see what we don't see, right? So we need help. And though that also implies listening, whether it's in the silences or from trusted people, but ways that he's saying, please, God, please help me to see the ways that I'm in Gehenna or causing Gehenna for others, and help me to live into that. And even though that might sound individualistic, for the Hebrews, it's never just a solo journey. Everything happens in community. Knowing God, living into the fullness, we need each other because it's hard to unlearn and relearn. If I hadn't seen other people holding the pen the right way, I wouldn't have known really what to do. I'd just be still smearing ink everywhere. So we need others. We need community to live into this. And I was incredibly blessed to start my ordained ministry in a church where I got to see this in action. And without going into the whole story of how that it happened in this community, it was in a very affluent suburb. People were from the outside, like living the dream in order to live in this suburban community. But in my church community, it was full of people who were in 12-step recovery. People who, on the outside, they had the good jobs and the good incomes, etc., but they had come to discover that something at work in them was in the way of living into who they're meant to be and living in their relationships, etc. And for some of those people, it involved hitting a bottom place of a failed job or a failed marriage. For others, it was a community coming and doing what's called an intervention that reflected back to them, you're giving us hell, and you're causing hell for yourself. But they told stories where they needed to see that what they were doing, the particular addiction and behaviors, that it was giving them hell, and they were creating a hell for themselves and for others. And then they were offered community and resources to live into a better story. Whether it's called a sponsor or a mentor, 12-step groups, recovery centers, spiritual practices. And I got to meet people who've been living this for years. And it was not easy because they would tell stories like that drink or whatever it was they were attached to, it felt like part of them. And it felt like to let go of that was to lose part of themselves. But they recognized for them, they had to do that or they were going to live in hell and give hell. And they wanted to live more of heaven and give more of that. And I've never seen a community of people who live so generously and creatively and kindly and justly. They were not perfect, by the way. I mean, if any of you are listening to this online from that church, you're like, oh, come on, Michael. But it really was. There was great beauty in people who had been practicing what we're talking about. I think for myself, this week I started a series, a seminar that's through United Seminaries in the Twin Cities that's around racial justice and paying attention to white privilege and white supremacy. And it's easier to not do that. It's easier, can feel uncomfortable. I'm a white guy. I don't want to hear those stories sometimes. I don't want to know about the structures, etc. Can I just live my comfortable little life where I am? But I've come to recognize that just to unconsciously live into that is to live hell and to give hell. And I want to be part of a better story. I want to live some heaven and give some heaven. It's not easy to unlearn and relearn, but Jesus shows us the way, and we can live it more and more together. Praise God. Amen.